Okay, let's start. Good afternoon. I'm Noor Kokiar. I'm the Executive Director of the Washington State China Relations Council. I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's event, which is co-sponsored by the Washington State China Relations Fund and the China Studies and the East Asia Center at the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine is creating new uncertainties in the global geopolitical and geo-economic landscape. China's strengthening ties with Russia, which might include sanction invading support and even military assistance, have potential to escalate tensions beyond today's ground war in Ukraine. To examine how China's actions might impact the Ukraine crisis and their broader implications, we are honored today to host two experts from the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies who will serve as panelists, as well as a moderator who is well steeped in global security issues. So let me take a moment to introduce the panelists and the moderator, and we'll get started. Our first panelist is David Bachman, the Henry M. Jackson Professor of International Studies at the University of Washington. He's been a faculty member at UW since 1991 and previously taught at Stanford and at Princeton. David's expertise includes Chinese politics, foreign policy, political economy, U.S.-China relations, and the rise of China in the making of the 21st century. David was the president of the Washington State China Relations Council back in 2005. He is also a member of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations and the Council of Foreign Relations. Our second panelist today is Scott Montgomery, who's an author, geoscientist, and affiliate faculty member at the Jackson School of International Studies. He's an expert on energy geopolitics, climate change, and technology. Scott is the author of 12 books, including one that he co-authored called The Shape of the New, 4 Big Ideas and How They Built the Modern World, which the New York Times selected as one of the 100 most notable books of 2015. And today's moderator is Nelson Dong, who's a partner in the Seattle office of Dorsey and Whitney, LLP. Nelson leads the firm's National Security Law Group and is the head of its Asia's group. He advises companies, professional societies, universities, and research organizations on export controls, economic sanctions, national security, and international trade and investment matters. He is an author and teacher on international technology law issues and has been an adjunct professor of international law at the Seattle University Law School and a guest lecturer at the University of Washington Law School. Nelson is a director of the National Committee of the U.S.-China Relations, and he's also a director at the Washington State China Relations Council. And he's an active member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and he's also on the Committee of 100. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Nelson to get started. I will note that we're going to have a moderated Q&A, which Nelson will moderate, and then we're going to accept questions from the audience. So if you do have questions, please put them in the chat box, and we'll do our best to work through all the questions that are submitted here. I'd like to note that the session is being recorded. A recording of the session will be available on the Washington State China Relations Council YouTube channel, and the recording link will be mailed to all the participants tomorrow morning. So Nelson, may I turn it over to you?
Thank you, Noor, and thank you again for the honor of taking part in this program with two really wonderful subject matter experts. I think we'll first begin with some opening statements by David and Scott to give us their respective overviews, perspectives on the war in Ukraine from their unique vantage points, and then we'll go through a series of moderator questions, and after that we will open it up for audience questions. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Nelson, and thanks for putting this together, all of you at the Washington State China Relations Council and my colleagues at the Jackson School. So let me start at the top, that I think China has been shocked by the way the Russian invasion of Ukraine has played out and developed in at least 5 ways. Those 5 ways include the invasion itself and the poor performance of the Russian military. The second being the Russian request for military supplies and other help from China, which we heard about just this weekend. Third, the rapidity of the uniting of the West and the Western publics against Russia, with implications for China and Taiwan. Fourth, the breadth, depth, and severity of the sanctions regime imposed on Russia, especially by the freezing of Russian foreign exchange outside of Russia. And fifth, and probably most important to the Chinese, China's isolation and the increasing pressure on China, coupled with a slowing economy and China's worst COVID outbreak since early 2020, to make a break from its limitless partnership with Russia. I'll go into these in a bit more detail in a minute, but I did want to comment first on an article in the New York Times this morning in the print edition that appeared yesterday afternoon online, where a number of Chinese imagine that China will be the one true winner from the war in Ukraine. I think this says more about wishful thinking caused by the information bubble they are living in than it does about likely outcomes. It seems to discount the possibility that China will be subject to secondary or even primary sanctions. It discounts how significantly the shift of Western public opinion is and how that carries over into views about China. And perhaps because the Chinese people haven't been informed, it discounts the rapidly expanding security cooperation among US allies in Asia and the implications of the election of Yoon Suk-yeol as president of the Republic of Korea. Okay, so back to the 5 shocks. The invasion. So Xi Jinping may not have been surprised by the invasion, that Putin may have told him about it in their meetings on the eve of the Olympic Games in February. But many academics in China and much of the informed public in China didn't expect the kind of invasion that took place. And no one, including Xi Jinping, probably expected the Russian military to perform so poorly. This, from the Chinese perspective, is what a modern military looked like. It's also the modern military that the Chinese military practices with, because the Chinese military hasn't engaged in modern military combat in many, many years. China also buys Russian weapons. Are they not very good? What does this mean for China's defense buildup? It's raising real questions, I think, in military leadership and among China's military defense complex. Second shock, the Russian request for Chinese weapons and other supplies. The Chinese expected that the Russians, once the invasion broke out or started, would easily overcome Ukrainian resistance. The fact that the Russians felt the need to ask for Chinese equipment suggests how ill-equipped and how ill-prepared the Russians were to face the Ukrainians, raising doubts about Russia's overall military and other competences. So are you linking yourself up with a sinking ship or not? Third, the uniting of the West. The rapidity with which NATO seemed to find a renewed sense of purpose, and the casting of Ukraine as a conflict between autocracy and democracy was also a shock. More significantly, the EU, NATO, and others see this not solely confined to Russia. China policy is being reconsidered and potentially hardened. Support for Taiwan in the US has not been stronger since the establishment of US PRC relations in 1979. The degree to which US is going to increase its support for Taiwan is going to be quite shocking, I think, to the PRC. Fourth, the breadth, depth, and severity of the sanctions. China survived the Trump trade war and seems to have basically dismissed the sanctions Biden warned Putin about. The freezing of foreign exchange reserves, though, was particularly unnerving, though the effects of the cutoff of the SWIFT system of interbank notifications and transfers was also a profound shock. To put in context, Russia had $640 or so billion of foreign exchange. China has 3.25 trillion, of which 1.06 trillion is sitting in US treasuries. So China has more to lose, and it is worried now about where its money is and what might happen to it. China is also feeling the inflationary impacts of oil, gas, and agricultural price increases, and those will ramify through a struggling Chinese economy at this particular time. So the impact of sanctions are much greater than they had anticipated. And then finally, China is increasingly isolated and under pressure. Once the war began, China expected a quick fait accompli, but the war grinds on. China is caught between a Russia wanting more from its unlimited partner and the West that demands that it rein in its partner and contribute significantly to the ending of the war with Ukraine, with Ukraine continuing to exist as an independent state. The bottom line then is that China faces fundamental challenges with its alignment with Russia, coupled with a slowing economy, a COVID outbreak that threatens to end dynamic zero COVID, and signs of growing political challenges to Xi Jinping, while not really perceptible on any tangible length, but are clearly growing. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has been bad for China. It's likely to get worse. And unless China really does mediate an agreement that is satisfactory to the West, which is unlikely to be satisfactory to Putin, it's going to continue to get the worst of both sides of this issue. And I'll stop there.
Scott, would you like to provide your opening comment?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to thank everyone from the Washington State China Relations Council for inviting me. I feel privileged to be here, and I hope what I have to say people will find interesting and perhaps even now and then enlightening. Energy is something that the media has a hard time covering, I would say, and this is what I say to my students, and that is not their fault. Energy turns out to be a very technical discipline in many ways, and without a background in that, it can be somewhat overwhelming or difficult to parse. I'm only going to make a few large comments here, and I'll start with this one. This Ukraine war is causing major changes in the global geopolitics of energy. There's no doubt about this at this point. And this involves not only Russia and the European Union, which you've heard quite a bit about, I imagine, but also the United States, Africa, South America, OPEC, and China as well. All of these places have central roles in the shifting of these plates, I'll put it that way as a geoscientist related to energy. The world, it appears, is entering a new stage in its energy relations, and it will not go back to the way things were. Above everything else, the war has made the issue of energy security a global concern. Now, this has been true in the past, but it is somewhat different at present, since we have fully global energy markets, not only in oil and gas, but in coal, in nuclear power, and in petroleum fuels. And all of these are areas that Russia has a very strong export position in and has relations with China about. The oil price shock, because that is what we are in the midst of right now, is having major impacts on the economies around the world, including on China, of course. And it is my view that it will also inspire changes in China's own domestic energy policies going forward. And we can discuss that a bit later. Finally, while the current situation has placed a great deal of emphasis on carbon energy sources, meaning oil and gas, to a lesser extent, coal, the shifts that are taking place may end up very well aiding the energy transition, the transition to non-carbon sources. This remains to be seen, and there is a great deal of controversy and debate about this now, as there should be, as there must be. But China is a central player here as well, very much. It has been to this point, and it will be going forward. And with that, I'll conclude my comments.
Thanks, Scott. David, let me begin first by going back to the point that you made among your 5 points about the sort of shock in Beijing and the reaction to the fact that there is an invasion at all. China has thus far stayed away from condemning the invasion. It abstained in the UN Security Council vote against the invasion. In fact, it won't even use the term war or invasion on any public media to describe it. Could you help us unpack that a little bit and understand why the Chinese have taken such a public position that is so bland at this point?
Well, it reflects a variety of trends in China. Some of them, the variety or limited variety of information sources that ordinary Chinese have. Some of it does reflect anti-American feelings in many Chinese nationalists. It reflects a certain amount of support for Putin's strongman image. That all of these things play in together and difficult, if not impossible, to unpack. So in that sense, some of that's going on, and the Chinese official media and the talking heads and so on that they have, repeating lies originally put out by QAnon that were picked up by Russia and China about the US-Ukrainian, the supposed US-Ukrainian bioweapons lab in Kharkiv, and repeating other Russian talking points. But as this is dragged on, as the costs of this have gone on, many in China are beginning to become quite alarmed about the consequences. And we're beginning to see quite critical opinions, at least what hint at quite critical opinions appear. So there's a link on the materials that the Washington State China Relations Council provided to an essay by Hu Wei, who's a policy intellectual academic, who wrote a quite critical analysis of China's position in this. And that was up on the internet in China for 3 or 4 days before it was taken down. Another well-connected Chinese policy intellectual, Huang Huiyao, head of the Center for China and Globalization, had an op-ed in the Times, which didn't make it in print, but was online, calling for China to play a role as a mediator and calling for a guarantee of an independent Ukrainian state. All of these things suggest that that people in China are at least informed people in China are beginning to figure out what's going on, and that the costs are mounting quite quickly. China's looking for ways to try to distance itself from Russia without really distancing itself from Russia, or at least to show it seems to care about the human rights crisis, the humanitarian crisis, and about its prolonged discussion that China has often upheld of sovereignty. All of these things are leading China to, if you will, speak out of both sides of its mouth, to waffle, but it may be signs that China is trying to find a way to play a more positive role. I mean, if we get to this question of can China mediate, I think that really depends on Vladimir Putin and how we read Vladimir Putin. Frankly, I have to say, I see him as so personally invested in making Russia great again that almost nothing will stop him from his war in Ukraine. And even and including the destruction of Ukraine and the Russian economy. China may sincerely offer its good offices for a solution, but I'm not convinced he wants any solution except his own.
David, if I can follow up just with one point, your second point was that the Chinese were surprised to get a request for further aid, and at least according to the public readout from Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, the request has come both for economic assistance, but also for military assistance. What is your take on how China will react to that specific request and whether they will provide that kind of aid and be visible in doing so?
I have heard, but not seen, reports that in fact China was filling its strategic petroleum reserve immediately before the invasion. This is somewhat unusual in the sense that the price of oil, at least prior to the invasion, was relatively high. China usually buys when the price of oil is low. So that, assuming that that was purchases from Russia, that would be one sign of support. Also reports about upped purchases of Russian agricultural products. So I think there were signs there, although Russia and China had in the first 2 months of this year a continuing increase in Russian-Chinese trade. So separating out how this plays into overall support becomes difficult to do. But clearly China sees an opportunity in expanding markets in Russia. Or it did until it became much more difficult for the financing to take place. So I think China was anxious to further expand its Russia market, but I think they really were taken aback by the question of supplying military equipment. It almost is like Putin was testing them. I can't imagine that Russia was so lacking in equipment that it needed transfers from China. I find that, I mean, I'm shocked by that.
So the Guardian today had a comment that speculated the division will be that they will not provide lethal or armament type equipment, but they will provide logistical support, meals ready to eat, rations and so forth, because the Russian logistics supply chain seems to have bogged down and been unable to support the troops in the field. Do you agree with that kind of a take on what the Chinese might choose to supply on the military side?
You know, the Financial Times had a different list today. Right now, of course, with most Russian aircraft, except military aircraft, grounded because of the sanctions, getting any supplies to Ukraine from China is going to take probably a week or so by rail. That, again, I think there's, you know, I wouldn't I think the utility of this is going to be very limited. I really do think that Putin is putting China to the test. And if they don't deliver what he wants, he's going to see them failing the test.
Thanks. Scott, let me turn back over to you and talk a little bit about President Biden's March 11 executive order in which he banned the future imports of energy products from Russia, crude oil and the other enunciated fuels in the order. Do you see that as a significant move either for the United States or for the Russian economy? Is that an effective tool to use in the toolbox of sanctions?
Well, I would say that it has symbolic power more than it has material power. It's not a major, Russia is not a major source of petroleum fuels and crude oil into the US. And the Canadians are rather eager to replace that, to replace it, whether the Keystone XL is opened or not, that pipeline. But it could be replaced fairly easily by the US itself, and most likely will be later this year if oil prices remain above, let's say, $90. And that will, a lot of that will come from the shale operators. For Russia, it's a small amount. The symbolic power of it is to basically to shake up the oil market and to make the commodity traders who determine the prices of fuels and make them more anxious and bid the price up, attract speculation or speculators, because the oil market is full of that. When prices get really high, it attracts a lot of speculation. And they come in and bid prices up. You saw today that actually prices fell a lot. A lot of the speculation left the market for other reasons that we can discuss later. But it has that symbolic quality. The other possibility is to try and convince some other states to do the same. And as we've seen, the UK and Australia have sort of followed suit to a certain degree, though their bans are not immediate. I think Australia is at 45 days and the UK will ban oil and gas and petroleum fuels by the end of 2022. So there's a certain amount of power that has, but I would comment that it's an election year, and of course, when gas prices go up, the only blameworthy person in the world is the head of the United States, as far as most of our consumers are concerned. So Mr. Biden has to look like he's doing something significant. Also, this was a very strong bipartisan issue. And is one of the few issues that has drawn the aisle, that has almost erased the aisle between the Democrats and the Republicans, though I wouldn't go so far as to say it erased it altogether. So there were a lot of positives, a lot of pluses. Now, I think that I'll stop there.
So if I could follow up just a little bit, you sort of talked about sort of the Western perspective and the market perspective to this cutoff. What do you think is going on in Moscow with executives at Gazprom and the other energy giants there that are responsible for export sales? Are they looking for alternative markets at this point? And if so, how do the sanctions cut into that to affect their ability to resell the stuff that they can't sell to the US or other Western countries at this point?
Yeah, so there are ready and waiting markets to take up the gap. And they could also take most of the oil were it to be banned from the EU as well. And most of that would go to China and India, and some of it to Indonesia, to Turkey as well, and perhaps Vietnam, but mainly to China and India. Both of those countries, their oil demand has been increasing, India's especially most recently. And China has a pretty wide spread of suppliers. The problem for the Chinese, and this is one of their Achilles heels, and this is also true for India, is that no matter how strong their economy and their military may be, they are importing 80% of their oil at this point. And that is a real energy security concern. And you can see why they would promote electric vehicles very significantly. Also, I would just comment that oil basically drives every military in the world still. So oil is a national security issue for what are now called the great powers once again. India needs a lot of oil. And India, the news today was that India had gotten a 25 to 27% discount from Russia to increase. It bought, I guess, about 3 million barrels just for the week. But this could be made something more permanent. Indonesia, which was once a member of OPEC, but no longer, and then joined again, is mostly an exporter of natural gas, of LNG, but an importer of oil, since its demand has grown well beyond its production capabilities. So Indonesia has become an importer of Russian oil, and they would be interested, I think, in increasing that. Turkey also has been an importer of Russian oil and especially natural gas for a long period of time. And Vietnam and Russia have been actually doing deals for drilling along the very edges and outside of the Great Nine Dash Line, which runs right through some oil fields and gas fields that Vietnam has drilled offshore. So Russia and Vietnam have a long-standing relationship. So there are ready markets, and I think knowing China's policy in the past, it sets kind of a precedent for bargaining down. And Russia may be in a situation because you make a lot more money from oil than you do from gas per unit energy, let's say per BTU. You can do a lot more with oil than you can with natural gas. But in any case, China would be very interested in bidding down the price even further than it has so far. I imagine that's going on, and Gazprom is probably and Rosneft, and Lukoil, they are probably discussing how low they can go to sell the oil that the buyers for Europe won't take any longer. I think that's probably a good answer. I'll stop there.
Sure. One further follow-up, Scott, on that. Chinese purchases in particular, what currency do you think China will use to pay for the oil and gas that it buys at a discount?
Well, it will argue for using the yuan, I'm sure. We'll have to see if Russia will accept that. Russia's not in the strongest bargaining position at this particular time. So we'll see, and that could very well set a very interesting precedent going forward. That would be one of the geopolitical shifts that I was referring to, and your perceptive question brought it out.
Thanks. David, coming back to you in regard to the need for Russia to lean on China at this point, what do you think Chinese leaders view as their own strategic interests in the longer run with regard to Russia, both vis-a-vis President Putin, but presumably beyond Putin into the next generation? Where do they want to be with regard to Russia? And, some, I think, skeptics have even said, would China end up owning Russia at some point as a result of the debts that may be piled up here? Is that an exaggeration, or is that something that leaders in Beijing really would seriously contemplate?
Well, we get into questions about what owning might mean, but that right now I'd argue that Xi and many in the CCP leadership, the Chinese Communist Party leadership, and the PLA, and Putin share a deeply critical view of the West, of Western democracy, and the current international system, or what President Biden and Secretary of State Antony Blinken call the rules-based international order that they see determined by the U.S. That China and Russia, both there's grievances about how history has treated them badly, and how they personally, Xi and Putin, have the historical task of undoing the history that has treated them badly. So there's strong affinity, I think, between the two, Xi and Putin. And I think, I needless to say, have a stronger sense of those around Xi than I do around Putin. That a sense of China being the dominant, if not the dominant power of the 21st century, is part of their sets of beliefs. Now, how a post-Putin Russia would fit into that is not entirely clear to me at this time. Certainly, they will understand that China will need Russian resources, particularly oil and food resources, perhaps. At the same time, though, they realize, I hope they realize, that Russia is much less economically important than the US and EU. Japan does nearly twice as much trade with China as does Russia. South Korea, more than 25% more than Russia. All of these places matter much more. And so much as Xi and those around him might not like it, they have to figure out how to balance these sorts of things. It's clear Russia needs China very badly under sanctions, and it will need China to support it after the war ends, however it ends, because whether it is a Russian victory, whatever that might constitute, or something that's mediated that preserves some part of Ukraine, Russia is going to have a pariah status attached to it and will not find people as readily willing to put up with it or to buy as much as they have to as they can. So China is in some ways hoping to see it develop into a buyer's market rather than a Russian seller's market for oil and raw materials. And in that sense, China, as they did in the past, will try to leverage, as Scott was suggesting earlier, price breaks and discounts and other things in exchange for gaining some access to Chinese currency, which, while it is a minor international currency, is beginning to have some modest weight internationally. So all of these things play into this. But as to getting back to owning Russia, I mean, Russia is a demographic disaster. More than 1 million more people died last year in Russia than were born. COVID is running uncontrolled, and Putin doesn't seem to be all that concerned about it. The population obviously is shrinking. There's large-scale emigration of people who want to get out of Russia. There's declining economic opportunity. And so China is going to be able to put lots of pressure on Russia, and Russia's viability to cover the amount of space they have and be secure is going to be ever more open to question. It's not simply NATO encroaching on Russia's borders, but a much more dynamic and powerful China on Russia's borders. And so Russia is only making its own situation worse.
Scott, swinging back to you, you had begun your opening comments with talking about the sort of the energy sphere and geopolitics generally, particularly in Northeast Asia, shifting because of these different altered patterns of the distribution of energy coming out of Russia and Ukraine. Could you expand on that a little bit and talk to us a little bit more about the regional implications for energy politics at this point?
Yes, certainly. So this does involve Russia and its eastern pivot, which Putin has been pursuing for about a decade now, building 8,000 mile pipelines is not cheap. And that's what you have to do to connect the Yamal Peninsula way up in the Arctic or the Western Siberian Basin with China, and also to connect it to the system that is now producing from Sakhalin Island. Sakhalin Island was a massive, probably the world's largest hydrocarbon project, stemming from, or excuse me, starting in about 1997 and extending up until about 2010. This was a massive project that involved almost every major international oil company, plus many national oil companies, those of Japan and South Korea included, but India as well, and Malaysia and Indonesia. So sort of a very large group of companies were involved in that. Mr. Putin changed the rules in 2004 when he decided to basically reduce everybody's share of whatever particular portion of the Sakhalin overall program they were working on. There are 9 different stages in this. It is a very large development project, which will probably continue for another 30 years in its development. Well, that would have been the case. I don't know about now. What Mr. Putin did is he changed what was called the Subsoil Law. And that essentially commandeered 51% of any project that was deemed to be in the national interest. And of course, Mr. Putin was the arbiter of that particular criterion. And, and therefore, there were a very large number of those companies that lost out, and many of them withdrew. Now, more recently, that has involved Shell and BP and Exxon directly, because they've decided to pull out of Russia for their own particular reasons. But that whole development project and what is called the Power of Siberia pipelines, number 1, which is finished, and number 2, which is or was on the planning boards to be built, and probably still will be built, those were intended to feed Japan and South Korea. Not to the same degree as China, because neither of those countries, or even the two of them combined, would equal China's long-term demand for natural gas and oil. But at this point, those two countries, Japan and South Korea, are reconsidering their imports from Russia. They also import a significant amount of coal, because those two countries use coal to generate power as well. And that's a major source of their emissions. For Japan, that came in the wake of Fukushima, when it shut down 35% of its electricity, all the reactors, and it's brought a few back. But nonetheless, it's still a significant, in the OECD, it's a significant consumer of coal. Japan requested from Gazprom to actually put a pipeline, undersea pipeline, to Hokkaido from the southern tip, which is a very large LNG facility now, but might have been a direct feed into Japan. And Gazprom said no. I imagine it regrets that decision at this particular point, because Japan has a free hand in turning away. This is part of the shift of the geopolitical pieces, because now Canada and the United States will make up that difference, most likely. Australia is a massive producer of LNG, but it's probably maxed out at this point. That's a guess. Not my guess, that is a guess of energy experts. But Australia has developed a very large LNG export industry. And they are the largest suppliers to China of maritime or seaborne natural gas at this stage. So you'll be having the idea, let me put it this way, of a union, an energy union of China and South Korea and Japan in terms of their dependence on Russia. This was all going to be a very cozy gathering around, a natural gas-fired campfire. That's coming apart completely. And this is a very interesting situation. Energy has been looked at as a potential unifier, maybe that's too strong a word, but at least a bond creation among these states in Northeast Asia. And I should say at some point, it's also been open to North Korea. Russia has proposed a number of pipelines that would go to South Korea through North Korea, or to go to both of them underneath the East Sea, Japan Sea. So there were a lot of ideas to bringing these states closer together through energy relations. And those are now looking very vestigial, I'll put it that way.
Thanks, Scott. I want to put one more question to David, and then we'll go to audience questions. David, there have been a number of commentators who have immediately leaped to drawing sort of parallels, Russia to Ukraine and China to Taiwan. Would you care to comment on that, and whether that parallel is apt to be drawn here, or is just misleading or not irrelevant?
Well, there are elements of all of those things in the discussion, in the sense that Obviously, Taiwan feels its existence threatened by the PRC. The PRC has made no bones about its goal of reunification, and that it has been preparing its military for the idea of reunification if it has to come to use of military force for close to 30 years now. So that's certainly one of the implications. I mean, the claims about sovereignty, I don't think we need to go into that. That PRC has always claimed sovereignty over Taiwan. China recognized Ukraine as an independent country. Russia recognized Ukraine as an independent country. So Putin is dissolving a claim to sovereignty. China is saying Taiwan never had sovereignty. But there are other aspects of China, Taiwan, Russia, Ukraine that are of note here. One of them being that the people on Taiwan are, of course, observing the resistance that societal, across the board, societal defense of their homeland brings. And they're thinking about reinstituting much broader military training, much broader senses of everyone being trained in how you resist a potential invasion. The US also seems to be drawing lessons in the sense that it's likely to up its quantity and quality of arms to supply to Taiwan. It's likely to be more overt about inviting, if you will, Taiwanese military forces to train with the US, in the US or other places. We're seeing support for Taiwan grow in Congress. One of the tiny riders in the spending bill that was just passed last week was that the US banned maps that included Taiwan as part of China. I guess they have to be a different color or things like that, which for some of you probably remember that China threatened either United or Delta Airlines with not being able to fly to China because they had Taiwan as a separate place to go to. And this is a response to that. Former Secretary Pompeo was in Taiwan last week, and he called for the US to recognize Taiwan as an independent country. So that I think you're seeing lots and lots of support in an effort to further deter a Chinese attack on Taiwan. And given the lack of success of the Russians in Ukraine, at least so far, the problems with their weapons and so on, all of these things may push a Chinese timetable, if there is one, further into the future. The foreign minister, Wang Yi, at the National People's Congress last week spent 90 minutes in his session complaining about NATO moving to Asia. He's clearly worried, and the Chinese government is clearly worried, that the enhanced security cooperation with Japan, with Australia, and perhaps now with Korea under a more conservative president, will lead to a NATO-like structure that would apply to Taiwan. So that Taiwan is in important ways the beneficiary of this war, and it may be one of the only ones. But I think that Taiwan's security position has been strengthened as a result, and this is going to upset China and further complicate US-China relations.
Well, we could continue going on, but I think it's time for the audience to take part. Nor, take it away, and let's take up some of the questions from the chat.
Okay, I'm off mute. So there are quite a few questions that have come in. I think between Scott and David, let's talk about India. We had a question, why did India abstain from condemning Russia's move into Ukraine? And the questioner is saying, is this driven primarily by energy concerns, or is this geopolitical concerns? Why is India kind of standing on the sidelines?
I can take that, and maybe David can expand it a little bit. India and Russia have a long-standing relationship going back to the 1950s. And this has involved weapons supply from Russia to India, among other things. And this has been ongoing through the Cold War and up to the present. It's not merely energy. In fact, India was not an importer of Russian energy to any significant degree until very recently. And even through the pandemic. So the chances for India now establishing that, it would be more an add-on to an existing relationship rather than something completely new. David, would you have more to add to that?
No, I think that, well, I would, it's not simply India, it's almost all of South Asia abstained in the vote. So that while we focus on India as the largest and most powerful country in South Asia, it is a reflection partly of mixed feelings at the very least about the US role in the world as well. And a sense that if this worked out as maybe Russia expected, that Russia could be a patron to some of these places. But I'm not sure that that if we had the vote again tomorrow, whether there wouldn't be changes in the vote either. You know, if these things all take place at a particular point, and the situation, as you've noted already, Nelson, has changed by the day, if not by the hour, and whether countries would want to, you know, try a do-over remains to be seen.
Okay, thank you. On energy, Scott, we've got a couple questions, and I'll list them off, and you can tackle them. One is what's the deal now between the U.S. and Venezuela, and then another question that is raised about Saudi Arabia. It seems to be getting closer to China, and also Saudi Arabia. The questioner says is willing to accept rupees from India. So what's going on here?
Okay, all right. Let's take the first one, the Venezuelan wild card. So there are probably two reasons why the executive, Mr. Biden, had people go down there and talk with that regime. Distasteful as I'm sure it was. One of the reasons is that Venezuela produces a large amount of heavy oil. And that means that the oil is quite viscous. It has a fair proportion of sulfur as well. And it is hard to refine, and there are only, and you have to essentially tune, not fine tune, but coarse tune, and then fine tune a refinery to take care of that kind of oil. Now, US refineries in the Gulf Coast were tuned that way, not for Venezuelan crude as much as for Saudi Arabian crude. And this was before the US became a major producer of oil and turned the geopolitics of oil on its head by becoming a competitor to oil, to OPEC and Russia. And it's too expensive for a lot of the companies to retune those refineries back. So they are looking for this heavy oil and somewhat sour. That's what you call oil or gas that has sulfur in it that will produce hydrogen sulfide in your refineries. So that was one of the reasons. If Venezuela could actually supply a bit more of this heavy crude to the US refineries, we could produce more gasoline and therefore lower prices. So this was the motive, to basically get a little bit, to soften prices for consumers. And so that would be not only gasoline, but largely gasoline, but also diesel. Diesel fuel is actually in fairly short supply around the world right now. So that's an important dimension as well. The other side, you know, Venezuela has actually been working with Iran that has a technology, because they have some heavy oil also, They have a technology to dilute this very heavy oil with much lighter forms of crude and what is called condensate or natural gasoline, and to make it so that it can work in regular refineries that don't need the heavy crude. And that's been helping Venezuela, or I should say the Maduro regime, to increase production. And they're on track to try and double their production and get back above 1 million barrels a day, and to go further and further. But, you know, that's the speech of an autocrat. That was probably less, you know, to add Venezuela significantly to the global market. It just can't do that. It doesn't have enough oil to really do that. Iran does. If the Iran nuclear deal is actually signed, Iran could put a fair bit more onto the market within about 3 to 6 months, and then more at the end of the year, and a lot more within a few coming years. But Venezuela is mostly for the US refineries. That's the way that looks.
And the other question was Saudi Arabia?
The Saudis. Oh, yes. So the Saudis are a very interesting group, aren't they? They are already the #1 exporter to both China and India. And they would like to stay that way. And they now know that both those countries have an alternative with Russia. And so they are willing to be quite flexible in wanting to maintain market share. That is the pole star of essentially of their energy policy through the decades, is to maintain market share. That is very important to them. That is the reason in 1986, when they were competing head to head with the Soviet Union, which had increased its own production and its own exports to a very significant degree, lowering the price of oil and really doing a lot of damage to the US industry. That was the reason that the Saudis actually opened up their taps and flooded the market and drove the price way, way, way down. That actually injured the Soviet Union significantly in terms of its ability to export and get hard currency from abroad. But that was in the late stages of the Soviet Union. So the Saudis are willing to do a great deal, even to punish themselves, even to suffer for a while, in order to maintain their market share, their control. This is also why the Saudis and the UAE were very bullish on making a partnership with Russia. That is sort of the new, we can't say this word, it's a 4-letter word, but it actually isn't, cartel, that involves OPEC plus Russia. It's normally called OPEC plus, but that's a way of, that's a bait and switch kind of thing. It really has acted as a kind of cartel between Russia and OPEC. There's some other suppliers, smaller suppliers, that are part of that as well. But the Saudis want, and the Saudis did that so they could control the global market and prices against the United States shale producers, which essentially flooded the market in between 2011 and 2014 and caused that enormous price collapse, because they just had no controls. They were just going and drilling and drilling and producing and borrowing money and borrowing money. And so that is part of the new power of the United States as a producer worldwide. The US has real export power now, and that will not go away. That will probably grow. And it will compete against OPEC, and it will compete against Russia. Not so much perhaps for China, but definitely for Japan and South Korea, portions of Southeast Asia, and Europe as well.
I think, yeah, we're up at our hour. If our panelists would agree, we'll go for an extra 10 minutes. So just that's it. We'll cut it off at 70 minutes. So if you're willing to do that, let's move on. And David, I have a question maybe that you'd like to start with, and that's what leverage does the U.S. have to really stop China from helping Russia? What can the U.S. do to kind of hold China back?
A number of things. That certainly that we can target particular companies with sanctions under secondary sanctions, whether that means cutting them off from technologies that the U.S. Established, founded, even if they're in Japan or South Korea or Europe. So there particular companies could be targeted, or if the United States really wanted to show the PRC that who's boss here, they could throw in the kinds of financial sanctions on the PRC that we've established with Russia, whether it's closing down the SWIFT system, which would make it extraordinarily difficult for the Russians to do, for the Chinese to do trade, or seize some of their foreign exchange, or freeze some of their foreign exchange reserves. Those are things that are out there for the U.S. to do. Now, the cost to the U.S. of doing this would be much higher than in the case of the Russians. We are much more interdependent, and China would presumably cut off supplies of things like pharmaceuticals, personal protective devices, many intermediary goods for U.S. industry, iPads, iPhones, et cetera, et cetera. So because of the kind of links in the supply chain, there would be many, many more costs to the United States for imposing these sanctions. I suspect that were the United States to become concerned about Chinese support for Russia, we would start out gradually and build up. But if it looked like that was not deterring the Russians, then the United States might quickly go to a much more embracing kind of set of sanctions. You know, again, these are thinking about scenarios. The U.S. really has shown, at least through the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that it wants to work with the EU, it wants to work with Japan. I suspect they would be more reluctant to go as deeply in at the start as the U.S. would, but I think they are deeply committed to Ukraine. And if China were seen as working to undermine the efforts of the international community to force Russia to reconsider its actions, then I think there would be some considerable support for sanctioning the PRC.
Okay.
Nelson, you're the expert on sanctions.
Yeah, Nelson, you want to weigh in on this? Off mute, please.
Yes, thank you. Sorry. I think David summarized it well. There would probably be selective targeting of key Chinese companies that were directly affiliated with providing the aid to Russia, particularly if they were, in the military or quasi-military sphere. And the United States has, in recent months, generated quite a number of new and fairly formidable potential sanctions measures built into the U.S. export control laws that are far too technical to go into here in a short overtime period as we have now. But if we want to explore that, we can do that in a future program. Suffice it to say, the United States does have quite a bit of incremental leverage if it wants to use it, but it would come at a very, very high cost, as David said a moment ago. And there would be severe repercussions within the U.S.-China relationship then once the United States starts moving down that slope.
Yeah, since aerospace is so important to our region, it'd be interesting to talk about China's domestic airliner, the 919. We don't have time today, but if the sanction, I know many parts of that are made in the U.S. or by U.S. companies, so that would strike quite a blow. Okay, we have about 5 minutes, so I'll ask for short answers for the next question. Scott, big oil's withdrawal from Russia. Well, what does it really mean? Are they walking away? Can they find a buyer if they pull out of these things? How's that going to work?
They have to, some of them, like BP, may have to just abandon the assets. The reputational jeopardy is very, very high. And they're looking down the road. These companies are in the midst of a transition themselves, and they're under fire, as most of us know. And this is remaining in Russia is just a bridge far too far, and is already damaged. So the one exception, Total Energies now, since they buy renewable energy firms, they are very, very deeply invested in a very large LNG facility up on the Yamal Peninsula in the Arctic. This is a massive facility, and it's one of Russia's gems. It's probably a gleam in Mr. Putin's stone cold eyes, as Robert Gates once said. But they are being heavily pressured themselves to leave, to just pull up stakes and leave. Yeah, that should answer that.
Okay. And David, a question about SWIFT. Isn't sanctioning SWIFT pushing other countries to move to the Chinese system? And will that not end up dethroning the US dollar as the world's trading currency?
Well, it may be in the long run, but look, SWIFT does something on the order of 40 million transactions a day. CHIPS does 13,000. So that we've got real questions of scale and scaling up. And then CHIPS also connects to SWIFT, and much of something like one of the articles I think that's on the list says something like 80% of CHIPS transactions are done through SWIFT. So that the messaging system is still predominantly based on SWIFT. And then the other question is, what currency are you transacting in? That China still does not have a fully convertible currency. So where are you getting the dollars? You're not getting them from US banks. You may be getting them from some other place that may have dollars, but you're still going to be cut off from the US financial system. The world has a hell of a lot more dollars than it has renminbi. And so, China's been trying to internationalize the renminbi for 20 some years, and it's 2% of global transactions. It's not going to increase all that rapidly, no matter what happens with SWIFT, I think. So that all of these things argue for the dollar remaining very important for the foreseeable future.
Or if I can just weigh in for one quick comment. There's a lot of misconceptions about what SWIFT is. First of all, SWIFT is not a US enterprise, it's a Belgian enterprise. So it's really subject to EU law and Belgian law rather than US law per se. It's also not a clearinghouse. It is a messaging system that provides secure, rapid communications between banks to give instructions to each other about moving money around the world in different currencies, so dollars and pounds and euros and other currencies. So people shouldn't get that confused with clearinghouses that exist to clear specific currencies like CHIPS in New York, which clears dollars, or the equivalent system in London that clears British sterling.
Great, thanks for the clarification, Nelson. So we are out of time. There were a few more questions. We didn't get to what this conflict is having impact on food prices and how Russia might move some of their food exports to China. Mm-hmm. We had a couple questions on the no-fly zone, what that might do. Another one on what we might expect might come out of the Brussels discussions, I think, that are taking place in a few days. But we are out of time, so we'll have to put those aside for a next discussion. So again, I would very much like to thank the panelists and our moderator for an excellent discussion. Obviously, the jury's still out. We're all watching this with bated breath, but we thank you very much for your informed opinions and for the excellent commentary. So with that, it's time to sign off. Thank you all for participating.
Thank you for having us.
You.
Thank you, Doug.
Thanks.